Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Estamos en el Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas presentando otra conferencia más del ciclo del Seminario de Historia de las Emociones que coordinamos la doctora Estela Rosselló y Susana Sosensky, su servidora, y muy contentas de recibir hoy en este espacio a la doctora Katie Barclay. Ella es, bueno, una destacada historiadora de las emociones, con quien queríamos discutir hoy y aprovechar para presentarla, ¿no?, también al público latinoamericano, que ya podrá conocer una parte de su trabajo en esta conferencia. La doctora bueno, está próxima a ser miembro del Departamento de Historia y Arqueología de la Universidad de Macquarie en Sydney, Australia. Ella es experta en temas de historia de las emociones, género, en vida familiar, historia de Bretaña y particularmente de Escocia e Irlanda entre los siglos XVII y XIX. De 2019 a 2024 fue jefa de estudios históricos y clásicos y directora del Centro Fay Game de Género de la Universidad de Adelaide. Y fue directora adjunta del Centro de Excelencia ACR en Historia de las Emociones. Ella estudió Economía e Historia Social en la Universidad de Glasgow y realizó también estancias de investigación en el Instituto de Estudios Irlandeses de la Queen's University. Entonces, le damos la bienvenida y le doy la palabra a la doctora Estela Rosselló para que dé inicio.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias Susana otra vez por estar aquí. La verdad es que es un lujo tener a Katie Barclay esta tarde con nosotros. Como ha dicho ya Susana, es una muy destacada historiadora de la historia de las emociones. Sus textos hoy en día son realmente imprescindibles para cualquier persona que hace historia de las emociones y por eso era muy importante para nosotros tenerla en este ciclo de conferencias que ha sido pues un lujo. Para que ustedes tengan acceso a su trabajo, el público latinoamericano pueda conocer más su obra, que aún no está traducida al español, pero que ojalá próximamente lo esté. Y sin más, pues te damos la palabra. Katie, very welcome to UNAM, to Mexico City and Latin American audience, and we are very looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real delight to be with you today and to talk about my work. It's kind of funny when somebody asks you to kind of give an overview of your contributions to the field. You suddenly think, oh, that's a kind of hard thing to do. But hopefully you'll enjoy it and kind of see, I guess, 20 years of work that I've done on this. So today my talk is entitled Performance, Power, Ethics, Histories of Emotion. And that's because I kind of think that my contributions have been in those spaces. I've been interested in thinking about emotion as a type of performance, its role in shaping power relationships, and increasingly in thinking about it as a kind of judgment or a sort of a moral order of how we shape, how we make decisions. Oh, my PowerPoint slide's not, there we go. So in this talk today, I'm going to talk about the problem which I'm situating as the state of the field when I got started, and why I guess I wanted to ask these questions and answer these questions, why my work took the direction that it did. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the methods that I've developed in my work and used in my work to kind of explore the past, and I put them under performance, social structures and ethics. Finally, I kind of ask, well, why does it matter? What are these tools good for? So we could maybe think about that. Perhaps you can tell me what they're good for. That might also be helpful. And then a conclusion. So that's just a sense of what we're going to do today. Okay, so let's kind of talk a little bit about, I guess, the state of the field when I got started. So when I started doing my PhD in 2004, the history of emotions was very embryonic. There was Peter Stearns' work on emotionology, which really thought about emotional norms, the kind of rules or guidelines that shaped emotional life, and where at least at that time, I don't know that he thinks this anymore, but at that time, he thought that as historians, maybe that was all we could access through the historical record, was a sense of what rules existed to guide people's emotional experiences. And he used a lot of prescriptive literature, so advice books, conduct books, to help think through, I guess, what rules people were being given about how to feel. Then Reddy wrote his book Navigation of Feeling around 2001. So that came out just before I started my PhD. But actually, I never found it at that time. It didn't come up for me in my searches. So I came across Reddy later on. It would have been helpful, I think, to have had him at this point. Rosenwein, actually, her book Emotional Communities comes out at the end when I finished my PhD, so I didn't have her either at that point. And so when I started thinking about my PhD project, which was called Love, Intimacy and Power, Marriage and Patriarchy in Scotland, 1650 to 1850, when I started that work, I looked at cultural psychology. And so I went and read what the psychologists who were interested in cultural variation were saying. And so a lot of my kind of thinking about this was coming out about cultural variety and difference in emotional experience. One of the things I think that did, or that work kind of suggested in a way, was that there was a universal human body, but that language and various other things were kind of guiding or shaping experience. And so it was a kind of model of which emotions are sort of are shaped, but are fundamentally kind of the same across time and across place. And I think if you're here, and as you know, that is the big thing that we've all challenged, I think, in the last 20 years of work. And we've now started to think about the ways that emotion, actually as a physical embodied experience, is also a cultural experience. And I think that my work is kind of fitting into that conversation, really. But in that particular project, which became my first book eventually in 2011, the questions I wanted to answer were really about what emotion was doing in these married couples' relationships. So I was using letters, lots and lots of letters, and reading these wonderful romantic accounts. 18th century letter writers are in Scottish context have a remarkably colourful language of love. It's lots of wonderful expressions and declarations, lots of passion in those texts. And this was kind of interesting to me because a lot of the historiography of marriage had kind of associated a lack of equality within marriage with a lack of emotion. And so they assumed that if you loved your wife, then you would actually have a more equal relationship. But if you didn't love your wife, then it would be more hierarchical. But the key issue for me is that this was very patriarchal society. These wives had very limited agency. Obedience was an extremely important social value for them themselves. Women wanted to be obedient. They saw that as important to being a good woman, to being a good wife. And so I was kind of interested in why these very hierarchical, very patriarchal marriages nonetheless had all of this emotion going on there that we might otherwise associate with equality. And so what I argue in that book is that in fact, the language of love reinforces patriarchy, and that instead of thinking about love and emotion as something that's distinct from power or equalizes it, we should think about it as actually a sort of disciplining force. And what I suggested was that to be a loving wife in the 18th century was to be an obedient wife. And you couldn't separate those things. And so for these women, if they were disobedient, they were also being unloving. And that was a really critical problem for any marriage because love was a very important social value. So that's kind of what I get at in that book. But the questions that kind of boil up, I guess, aren't just about that specific case study. They become about the emotion as something more than just a feeling that we use to express a certain kind of relationship, but also as a disciplinary force. So suddenly emotion moves out to being something that starts to guide people's behaviour, that acts to have an active sort of presence in the world. And now perhaps those ideas have been explored by many historians, but when I was doing that, there wasn't much competition thinking about these things. And so I think where my work has went since then has, power has always remained very important. But I've been very interested, I think, in emotion as a kind of structure or discipline, and perhaps even a social structure, and to start to think about emotion as something outside of the self that actually does certain kinds of disciplinary work that we nonetheless experience in our bodies. And I think what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this paper really is the different ways I've thought about that problem of emotion as a kind of disciplinary force. But I think for me, the key questions at that time, the problems I started wanting to answer, were about how do emotions shape our relationships? What role does it play in creating, I guess, power dynamics in families or in other kind of contexts? I was also interested in moving beyond norms and rules into experience. And so that work is very much based on correspondence and how people talk to each other. And I was interested in all the times that people broke the rules, or where it got messy and complicated, as marriage always does, and where people fight and argue and fall out and sometimes separate and live in other places. And so thinking about how you have these rules for love, you have these rules for obedience from women, but they don't often work or always work in practice. So how does emotion actually operate as an experience and not just as a set of guidelines or practices? And finally, and maybe less in my PhD, but certainly I think since then, I've been very interested in methods. And so how do we actually go about finding this stuff out? And so a lot of my work, I think, has been suggesting different kinds of methods and approaches that help us get into the historical archive, understand the records, analyse the records. And some of this work has kind of came out specifically for students. So this book we have on the screen here is my guide for students into methods and sources. And it's a kind of how to do this. You've got a concept to like emotional regimes. You've got a set of sources like letters. How do you put those two things together and find out something interesting? And so my work has, in my own work, I've been looking for new, but I've also been hopefully explaining how you do this as a method for other people. Okay, so performance. So I think the first or most important kind of intervention that my work made, and which really came out in my second monograph, which was Men on Trial, which you can kind of see here, was really about the idea of emotions as a performance. So when we think about emotions scholarship now, most of us are familiar with practice theory, which Monique Shear brought to us and kind of took Bourdieu's work on habitus and kind of translated it for emotions. And so practice theory thought about emotional experience as a form of socialization. And so those rules about emotional life, those norms, were things that you were taught as a child. You were taught how to express emotion. You were taught when it was acceptable to express emotion. You were taught how to manage your emotions in various ways to regulate them. And that process of socialization made emotion feel like a natural experience for you as an actor. So you didn't feel like you were kind of acting or performing. It all felt very natural, but nonetheless, it was a kind of cultural process of socialization. And I think that I like this idea a lot, and I do think that basically socialization is critical to how we learn emotions. But I kind of wanted a slightly different model to think through this issue. And so I went to performance theory. And so I was reading like Judith Butler and Irving Goffman and also Lefebvre and this concept of space to really think about emotions as things we do. And so the kind of model that I came up with here was that emotions are a 360-degree experience. And so they're not just things that happen in the body, but they are also things that happen in particular places, like a church or a football field or a park. But you do emotions in a place, and then you bring a set of resources to that place to do those emotions. And these resources include your physical body and your feelings, the kind of experiences we usually associate with emotion. But they also include your physical body and gestures, right? Those kind of movements that you are taught how to express emotion. How do you show anger on the face? How do you express love through the body? We also have resources that include other things about your body that are kind of shape how you behave. So your gender, your class, your race, other kind of disability or abilities, all of those bring different kind of resources to your experience of the world. And so they're part of your body. But we also have other things that we bring with us, our material goods, the clothing that we wear, the glasses on our face, our mobile phones, our technologies that we use every day in our lives. And we also bring with us our knowledges, the cultural ideas, our values, our beliefs, the discourses that surround us in the world. And we have all of these resources as a package. And we come to a particular place in a particular moment, and in that moment we have an emotion, we experience an emotion, and that emotion involves all of those dimensions. And what you will feel in a particular context might be different from me, because the resources that you bring are different from the ones that I bring. So an example here, which is one that I use in my book for my students, is you're in a pub and somebody comes up and insults you, okay? And you're a man in this context. And so you're a man who's just been insulted, and you live in a culture where honor is very important, and you think to yourself, my honor has just been besmirched. I should respond. How should I respond? And you might think, I should punch that person. I should regain my honor through violence. That's a normative response. I feel angry, I've been insulted. However, you look at the person who has insulted you and you think, that guy is much, much bigger than me, and he's much more muscular, and if I punch him, he's going to hit me back, and I am not going to come out of this well. Make a rational decision in that moment that violence is not a good response. And so instead, you make a joke, and you say, oh yes, haha, fat, funny, hilarious. And the other person responds laughing, and so let's have a drink. And so you both have some alcohol together, and then you build a friendship. So you have this moment of tension, anger, this potential, and a path is set out based on your assessment of yourself, your own body, your culture, and what norms are brought into play, but also the other actors in the room in that experience. And that leads to one place. If the person who had insulted you perhaps had been a smaller man, and you had thought, I can punch that man, perhaps it would have been a very different story. You would have punched him, he might have punched you back, a whole other bunch of people in the pub might have got involved in the fight, someone might have died, you might have ended up in prison. There's a whole other set of scenarios that could come out of that experience. And basically, in those moments, those judgments that are also about your emotions, but also about your rational assessment of a situation, that are also about the place. In a pub, a fight is not the end of the world. Probably in a church, if the same thing had happened, you wouldn't have fought because it's inappropriate to fight in a church. So the context matters to how you actually respond to your emotions. And so what I kind of think about in my work through performance theory is the way that in every moment, when you actually do emotion, you don't do it abstractly or in some sort of in your head at a different time, or maybe not usually. You do it in a moment in response to a set of circumstances, and really to understand why you have a particular emotional experience, you have to take that big picture into account. And I think that performance theory actually offers a better model for thinking about that experience than practice theory does. Because in some important ways, practice theory still relies on this kind of, there's a discourse in the world, you are socialized into that, and then you behave in particular ways. And all of those decisions and tensions and messy contexts that actually shape your behavior are not as well accounted for in that method. So I'm not saying you couldn't adapt practice theory to do that, but I don't think people do. I don't think it works as well. And whereas performance is much more flexible and allows you to think about a whole range of different tools or resources that people have to help explain why an emotional experience occurs in a particular time, in a particular moment, and what kinds of emotions might occur in that place. I think that this has an advantage of several advantages for historians. One is it decenters our interior physical experience. And so in some ways, as historians, that's the hardest part to get at. Because if we are even at the luckiest, you're a modern historian, you're doing oral history, somebody tells you what you feel, You still have a kind of barrier of language, which is that we use language to kind of take an amorphous, abstract experience and to put it into words. So you kind of always have words in the way of accessing interior life. If you're a historian of dead people, it's even more challenging again. You've got to use letters or other kinds of writing, and they are for a particular audience. They have genre rules. There's certain things you can say in a letter, other things you shouldn't say in a letter. So they're never a natural or immediate experience. And so you kind of have all these restrictions as a historian. But performance theory says, let's worry less about the interior experience and let's worry more about that 360-degree world. And so suddenly we can think about, where did it happen? What's going on? Who's in that place? What person are you? What body do you have? What do you wear glasses? Have you got one leg? What difference does your gender make? So you can think about the people and what they bring to that experience. You can think about the place. You can think about other resources like relics or ritual objects or material clothing or goods or food or alcohol. You've got all of these other items. And you as a historian might know very little about a person or what they're thinking, but you might know a lot about the place that it happened. You might know about a riot, where it happened, the size of the crowd, this course of events. And so suddenly you can start to think about these kind of these knowledges that we have about particular historical context as access points into an emotional experience. And so we could look at a relic, for example, and look at the way it has been used, the wear on the object, where it was rubbed or kissed, or what marks of wear are there. And we could start to build a story about people's emotional lives. And this is never to say that you can then predict easily that what a person felt in that exact situation, is what, like a relic might not tell you that that particular person in that particular context felt what they should feel. But I think it does help us think about what people should feel, and perhaps because we do think emotional norms are important to our emotional lives, we get a sense of a cultural norm or a mentality, or what an average person might feel in a particular context. But as historians, that opens up all of these other kinds of historical sources to study, and moves us away from having to focus on personal narratives and narratives of the self, which I think in the early emotion scholarship was our primary access point to emotional experience. I also think now, as ideas about the body are changing, and we are much more interested in cyborgs, I guess, on bodies as things that do not stop at the limits of our skin, but use technologies and use other kinds of materials to extend our how we are in the world, then actually performance theory is better for helping us understand those processes. So now we can think about our mobile phones as a part of our emotional lives, because so much of our emotional life, or for some people, is not done online. And so we could think about social media as a place where we do emotions, but also a sort of a kind of a part of how emotional life is negotiated for individuals, and to think about our technologies as extensions of the self. So it's a model that allows for those new ideas coming from kind of new materialism and other kinds of technological sort of concepts of self as bodies that extend beyond our physical boundaries, that extend beyond maybe more traditional senses of self as bounded or individualized. I also think it is kind of, not maybe more so than practice theory, which does this well, it's good for collective emotions. We don't just have to think about the emotions of the individual, but we can start to think about emotions as dynamics that happen between people and places, and to think about how those different resources brought by different individuals kind of talk to each other, complement each other, lead to particular kinds of emotional experience. So I think that's why I like performance theory, and why I like it more than practice theory, because of this kind of way it extends, but also because for historians, it allows us to use a whole set of different primary sources that we might not otherwise be able to use. And for some social groups, like the very poor, that might be the only kinds of sources we've got. And so it allows us to see the emotional worlds of groups of people that we might not otherwise have known about. Okay, so that's, I think, I guess, the underpinning theory that really, I think, has supported my work for the last sort of decade. And I'm going to now kind of talk about some other things my work has done. But I think that idea of performance as a kind of way of thinking about the self kind of influences a lot of my other work and approaches and the kinds of things I'm doing. Okay, so I guess in this section of the talk, I want to talk about, go back to social structures and power, and to think about some kind of key questions that I think that I've always been interested in answering. I kind of raised this in the beginning, and the ways that performance theory allows us to kind of think through some of those ideas. So, social structures and power. So if we are all good sociologists, which we might not be, social structures are those things around us that act as constraints on the self. And it kind of produces a model of the human kind of here and of the world around us as a form of discipline and a constraint, and where we, if we had complete freedom, which is not possible, would perhaps behave differently or be different had we not had those structures and constraints shaping and guiding us. And I think it is a model that has very much a tension between the self and society, the individual and the community, the one and the group. These are always a kind of a tension or a dialectic that have to be negotiated in this model. And I think one of the things that I have been interested in a way, is actually thinking about what those claims, I guess, mean when we start to think about the self, the individual, as separate from society, as distinct from, I guess, these norms. Because a lot of the work of emotion scholarship has been thinking about how we understand emotional norms as things people actually experience in their bodies and with emotion. And I think all of the theorists that are famous in the field, and Reddy and Rosenwein and Stearns, have all been grappling in particular. So Stearns in the beginning with emotionology, he saw we could identify a norm, but I think he had quite a big space for individual agency within those models. He saw them as a set of rules that people might follow, ideally followed, would be punished if they didn't follow, but nonetheless weren't things that were entirely naturalized. Whereas both Rosenwein and Reddy, I think, are dealing with more of a model of naturalized social norms, that we respond angrily when our honour is besmirched because of the fact that we've been taught to do that since we were children, and so we don't really question that very much. And so this, at the start, they're already saying that the reasons that emotions are social is because these norms are become things that we do through naturalization. We don't think about it, we just do it. But one of the kind of problems, perhaps, or limits of that approach is it still very much is a top-down. Social structure is the important part, and the individual is the thing that is disciplined by social structure. And the capacity for the individual to move back and to speak to social structure is always limited, and I guess isn't really accounted for in some ways. And so I think I have been interested in thinking about, can we flip that more, and can we think a bit more about whether or not social structures are actually things that we do, and which lots of individuals do, and which then kind of are created through performance, through kind of playful activities and within particular situations. So, and the way of thinking about this might be through the law. So the law says, thou shalt not murder. No, it's bad, do not murder people. But you're in the pub and you're in that context, and suddenly you punch the man and he falls and hits his head and he dies, and then you have committed murder. So there was a set of rules that you might actually feel very strongly about. You might be like, I do not believe in murdering people. Murder is wrong. Very much accept that as a norm. And then, but nonetheless, you find yourself having committed a murder. And you might feel very bad about that. Like you didn't just go, oh yeah, that was right, that was a good decision. You were like, oh, that was a bad decision, made in anger, made in haste. And so in a way, we can have these norms and rules, but when we come to particular situations, people don't always follow the rules, and there's lots of reasons why that doesn't happen. And so instead, we can think about instead of thinking about the law as this kind of dominating force, we can actually start at the bottom and go, well, what happens if we think of the world as made in these moments? And these moments are where people punch someone in a pub and then have to think about what that means and what that means for themselves, for the person who died, for their family, and for legal practice and law. And because in some ways we might go, well, that person, this isn't murder, they didn't have intention to kill, it was in the heat of a moment. Maybe we would say it was manslaughter, maybe we would even say that it was self-defense. There's lots of negotiation that goes on around those meanings, which don't only shape the individual situation and the outcome of that situation, but also feed back into discourse and shape ideas about what murder is, when it should be punished, what does that mean. And so I'm kind of interested in actually thinking about the bottom part of social structure as an active part in making our sense of the world, and that perhaps we should worry less about the discourses or the rules and more about actually what happens in practice, because it's in practice that often these things get played out, they actually happen. And the law or the rules or the norms are always potentials, but they're never kind of real until we actually put them into practice in a particular situation. So this is what I think kind of performance theories allows for us, is to just see the things like the law as yet one resource amongst many, and not the only one and not the most important one. And so because of that, it starts to shape the kind of sense of how power works in particular societies, what's important. It helps us explain why outcomes, you might say, well, in that situation, he murdered someone, so he should be punished. But in many of those situations, there is no punishment. A bunch of people on a jury or a prosecutor decide that prosecuting in that situation was not worth it. It wasn't in the name of justice, right? And so we can actually explain better what happens there if we think of the law as just one part of the story and not the biggest part of the story. So what I would suggest is performance theory is really allowing us to think more carefully and with more nuance about the relationship between the individual and social structure, and to start to think of social structure as a flexible kind of resource and not a dominating or a kind of very hard and inflexible one. And this is what I kind of like about it. And one of the things it does for emotions is it allows us to start thinking about emotions as active and kind of agentic in shaping power relationships, but also in shaping social structures themselves. And I think Reddy gets at that in his concept of regimes and of refugees, where certain kinds of emotional liberty or experience that you have in a refuge eventually starts to act as a form of resistance against a regime and then turns it over. And so you can see emotions as having agency in that context. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. But I also want to kind of make it a bit more generalized than that, that norms are always a bit flexible, always messy, always things we do in practice. And so really emotional life actually plays a big kind of role in our kind of experience of negotiating the world. And so we can start to kind of maybe worry less about that binary and more about what actually happens on the ground and what experience looks like. And I think that starts to kind of collapse the distinction between the social structure on the one side and the self on the other. These things sort of kind of come together and more closely. And it's another way of thinking about how social structure is an embodied experience, which also is suggested in Shear when she talks about habitus and practice as a sort of embodied experience of socialization. So to me, these are the key questions that started in my first book, and what I hope I did with my second and performance theory is start to kind of come up with, I guess, more sophisticated explanations for why we were seeing, I guess, the emotions doing the kinds of things it did in those very hierarchical kind of relationships, and to help us understand that better. Okay, since then, this is my third book and fourth. I've been thinking about how we then take this forward from big things about social structure and really big concepts about how the nature of the human and its relationship to the world, into thinking about some kind of more specific situations or scenarios. So my book Caritas, and this also is the framework I use in my academic emotions book, which is about academics today and their own emotions, in case everybody should be interested in that book. But emotional ethics want to get at the fact that emotions actually are a form of judgment or decision making. So when you're in that pub at the beginning and you get insulted and you feel anger because your honour has been harmed, that anger is a kind of judgment, and you at that point make a decision based on that. And so what I want to think about with emotional ethics is the way that emotions actually form part of judgment and decision making, but especially ethical life. And so we can think of an emotion like love as a form of, so caritas is what I do in the book, but it's a form of love that actually suggests certain kinds of ethical practices and behaviour. So if you are a loving person, you will do certain kinds of things. And if you believe that being loving is important, then you will want to do those things because you will want to demonstrate that you are a good person, you are a good and loving person. And of course, you will fail because we are human, and humans fail in all sorts of situations. But I think a lot of our current theory of emotion tends to have thought about emotion as things you have or that you didn't have. But actually, what an ethic allows us to think about is emotions as an aspiration. It's something we want to do, we try to do, that we kind of exercise as a practice, but we don't always do it well. We sometimes do it well, but we don't always do it well. And so starting to think about it as a tool that we can use in ethical life, but also as a kind of way of thinking about emotion is something that isn't always achievable. And I think that the performance theory underpins that, because you think of it as a sort of situation with a set of resources. One of them is the norms that you have about love, for example, and ethical behaviour. And then in that situation, you decide whether or not you want to be loving based on a whole lot of other scenarios. And so I think that the performance theory explains it, but the ethics allows us to start thinking about the ways that certain kinds of moral judgments start to be really tied into emotional life, or ethical judgments, depending on your preference. And to think about, that what we want to do and that we fail to feel is also a kind of important part of the story. And so in Caritas, I talk about that in terms of early modern Europe, but and thinking about the concept of Caritas as a Christian ethic in early modern society. But in academic emotions, I think I use the same idea of an emotional ethic to think about why and when academics think they're being, why they're suffering, when they think they've experienced harm within the institution, and the way that their ideas, we have very strong, very Foucauldian ideas about suffering and institutions that underpin when we think something is right or wrong in universities. And so kind of to explain our moral subjectivity as academics. Moving forward from that, I'm now working on two kind of projects. One is on emotional public opinion. So I think we are all familiar with the sense that the public sphere can be a very emotional sphere. I think if we look at the US at the moment, with those very kind of, it feels very fraught, that you have two sides, they have very strong opinions, but they are all tied up in different kinds of emotion, and the way that emotions are mobilized in that. So Kamala Harris, she's pulling out her Obama, she's kind of looking for hope and for people, bringing people together. She's got some very positive emotional language that she's using to mobilize a public opinion that supports her political position. Trump, he's using anger and ressentiment. He's got other kinds of emotions that he's mobilizing in his public sphere, and they are creating a sort of mass emotion that we particularly see in the media. And so you can kind of see this as a sort of performance, in the sense that it's not done by individuals very often, but it's happening in the public sphere, and it feels tangible and it feels real. And so I think with an emotional public opinion, I want to think about how we form publics as abstract communities, and the way that emotions become collective through media, but in particular spheres. And the way that emotion is real, it's not just a rhetorical effect. So we think about rhetoric as you have a wonderful text that suggests people should feel a particular way, but how do we relate that to the group or the crowd? And I think of the public as, I guess, the modern crowd in a way, and to think about the ways that that deployment of emotion is a kind of deployment of a group or community experience of a particular feeling. So my emotional public opinion is thinking about that kind of situation. I've also been thinking about intergenerational emotions, which is how we feel over time. So we love our grandparents, we love we should admire or respect our ancestors of longer lineage. But how do we actually explain that kind of love? And I think that's kind of an interesting question, because we know that the honor, respect, love for our ancestors is a very important value for many people. But we don't have very good words to explain it, or very good logics. And lots of emotional life depends on this sense of connection between two people who know each other, and so that intimacy is real. So you love your grandparents because you've met them, they've cared for you, you've cared for them. There's a real relationship there that kind of becomes the foundation for love, for an emotional relationship, for hate maybe. But intergenerational emotions are a little bit like maybe ethics, in the sense that they are things you should feel, sometimes fail to feel. They're abstract, but they expect certain kinds of emotional work to happen over a distance, over time and space, without actually there being a real kind of relationship there. So in some ways, I think it's not dissimilar to the thinking that I'm doing about public opinions, where we're also kind of creating collective emotions that are abstract with other individuals in our communities that we don't really necessarily know. So of course, you might know your neighbours, you might share political opinions with them, but you might also see yourself as a Democrat with many people who you've never met, who you identify with. So you can see Benedict Anderson's, imagined communities coming in here. So really strong sense of emotion as an imagination of a group, of a collective. And intergenerational emotions, I think, are a similar kind of imagination work that we are doing, and that we're doing it instead of with other people around us, with other people across time and space, and to kind of think about them as related kind of ideas about how we relate in abstract terms, I guess, and without thinking about physical relationships. And so this is, I guess, my new foray is into thinking about imagination as an important component of how we do emotion work in various kinds of contexts, but where emotion remains quite important. Okay, so I need to kind of start wrapping up now. So why does all of this matter? Well, I kind of hope we've sort of seen some of that across this talk. I think for historians, it matters because it helps with a limited source problem. If you don't have many sources for the people you want to study, then being able to not need narratives of the self and to move towards material culture sources or descriptions of people's behaviour or bodies by third parties, or paintings, they all allow you to kind of access emotions in new ways, and opens up different kinds of histories that we wouldn't have been able to write if we didn't take that approach, if we didn't think about emotion as something beyond the self and as having these resources. I also think it helps us think about society and the individual. So we thought about, I think a lot of our work on society and individuals is you've got society over here and the individual, and we're trying to explain how they meet and the tensions there. And I think that performance theory helps collapse that better than many other models. So I think that's useful for people thinking about that relationship and that question. I also think it's helpful for thinking about social structure as embodied experience. We see that in practice theory, but I think it helps us also think about the body as something not just the narrow body of the physical self, but also as a body that extends into physical spaces and places and then into material goods. So it's then thinking about social structure as something that manifests through these wide resources that happen in particular places. So it expands the body that is being embodied in some ways. And now I'm hoping, and what I hope to do in some new work, is to really think about how this helps us think about aspiration and imagination. And so to think about emotions not just as concrete, solid things that happen in response to things, but as playful potentials that allow us to help make judgments and decisions and to be mobilized in particular ways as we try to think about relationships that are not just real and made between people, but abstract and less concrete in various ways. And that's where I hope to go next in my work. So, in conclusion, what I hope I've offered to the field are some sources and methods for how you do the history of emotions, and some approaches that help you do this work more effectively and with different kinds of sources. I've offered some performance theory as a kind of a detailed model to explain how this works and how it affects the self. And then I've offered a bunch of sort of smaller tools for particular kinds of projects: emotional ethics, emotional public opinion, intergenerational emotions. And there's articles on all of these things that are out there if you want more on that. And as I suggested, future directions, I want to think about imagination and aspiration as ways that we do emotional life. So thank you so much for your time, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Oh, thank you very, very much, Katie. I really love your work, and I think truly that everything you are doing is very, very new, attractive, and suggestive. So thank you for being with us here today. And let me tell you that we are reading you in our class. Maria Elena knows that. And well, we are very glad to have you here, and it's a privilege to listening to you. I don't know. I mean, I have some questions and comments. I don't know.
No todavía.
No? Bueno, I love this idea of your work about imagination. And sometimes it's very, I mean, when you are writing a history of emotions, you need to imagine some things. And sometimes it's like, how do you say it? I mean, I'm trying to say it in English, but many colleagues that don't know very much about history of emotions and its methodologies, keep asking, well, but maybe you are just imagining that, you know, or maybe it's just your interpretation, you know. But I know that nowadays there's like a new perspective which defends imagination when doing history of emotions. And I would like if you can tell us a little bit more about that and the right and the need we have to use imagination, especially when we are working with the interior self.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a very old historiographical debate in some ways, that what role should our imaginative capacities have when describing past societies? Where does the boundary lie between empirical evidence and what we kind of add to that? I think that we worry more about it in emotions because we never really know what's inside a person's heart, shall we say. We worry about those hearts, probably too much. And so there's kind of a sense of which you only ever see words on a page or behaviors in a kind of in the world around us, and you've kind of got to assume that what's going on underneath the body, I guess, is the same as what you see in the world, if you can even see those things in the world, depending on your sources. I think that modern concepts of self, though, such as modelled by performance theory, don't worry about the idea that there is an internal self that is unique and distinctive, and that kind of and that we need to capture in some ways. It's a very Western idea, and it comes, I guess, from those 18th century individualist theorists that are so influential on Western thought, expansively kind of thought about. And not all societies think about the self as in that way. For some, there is no distinction between what you say and do in the outside and what happens inside. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, actually, is about what cultural norms about the self do we bring to that conversation. And I think some of these theories that we're doing that are trying to explore that relationship are also offering us robust ways of saying, well, you don't have to worry too much perhaps about what you can't see. You just kind of focus on what you can see and you acknowledge the limits, like any good historian, the limits of what you can see tells you. But that's not quite answering your question,
No,
which is to think about, well, can we be more imaginative in our writing? Do we do creative writing exercises? When can we fill in gaps about what we don't know? And I think I'm quite happy for people to do that work. I think all forms of narration are a sort of discipline on a set of evidence that is fragmentary and kind of fractured, and we are all storytellers. And so in some ways to acknowledge that imaginative capacity and to open up certain kinds of stories and accounts we might not be able to do without that work, I think is useful. And I think that we can think about, you can say, oh, well, it doesn't feel that as empirical, but it does allow us to have different kinds of accounts, and that's, we can just think about it as a method, and to think about it as a method with some kinds of limits as well as some kinds of benefits that we find useful.
Yes, I mean, I will ask you later something else, but do you have any?
No, we don't have questions in YouTube. Invitamos a quienes nos acompañan en Zoom, si quieren platicar con la doctora Katie. Aquí hay here we have some students and one wants to ask you some.
Si quieres, pasa para preguntar. Perfecto.
Hello. I hope my question is going to be clear, I hope. But I want to know more about how can we identify the experience that people have in different places. For example, in public places or in private places. Now, how can we know what are the methods for look for these differences? What is the, I don't know, what could be the questions we can make to the source or have an idea of what are these differences between the experience and the emotions in public and private places? Yes.
I think in the first place, a good question is what's public and what's private for these communities. So we like that, sometimes that's quite obvious and you have a very rigid public is outside of the house, it's in the public space. Some places public might be particular rooms of the house, so a public dining room with guests might be public, but a bedroom with only 2 intimate people in it might be a private place. If it is the wedding of a monarch, the bedroom in that moment is a public place with all the people watching the wedding ritual. So we kind of have to start to think about, well, what is public here, what is private, and what expectations for privacy and otherwise would we have in those kind of contexts. But I think beyond that, a bit like any kind of space, every space has its own sort of rules around what kind of emotions are allowed there, not allowed there. And I guess as a historians, we might try to start to think about that and to say, well, in this private bedroom, these sorts of behaviours are allowed, these sorts of behaviours are not allowed, these emotions are allowed, these are not allowed. How can we think about that? And then how can we compare that to the emotions that are allowed in a range of other contexts? And then putting those things together, you can kind of say, well, in places that are seen as public in this society, they have these things in common, and places that are seen as private, they have these things in common. And then you can start to think about what public and private might feel like, how people conceptualize that. But I think in some ways you do come back to thinking about a particular space and what's happening in that space and what kinds of things are allowed in there. And so then you need good records, I guess, about what kinds of things happen in a particular space at a particular time. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Katie, Thank you very much for your lecture. It's very, very interesting. I wonder if performative acts differ when they're carried out by individuals and versus collectiveness, and how can we study that? What are the differences in order to think performativity? No, and this is one question. And I am very curious about your book, Academic Emotions. Could you also tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the individual versus the collective kind of emotions, this is kind of, I mean, I think individual performances are in some ways easier to think about if you have the right kind of record, that you think about what did a particular person do in that particular situation, what evidence do we have for that, and then you can build up a picture of their performance. And then we can also think about, if we're interested in gender, say, what did other men do in similar situations? Is there a pattern? That's a gendered experience of a particular kind of emotion. Then there's collective, though, when we think about crowds or people at concerts, or collective emotions as group emotions, as things we do as something more general beyond the self. And I think in some ways you can do a similar thing of going, well, we have a group, we have a riot. What are the group doing together? How do this community think about that unit as something, as a community, not just as a group of individuals, but as something that happens in its own way? And that kind of gives us a sense, I think, of, I guess, how say crowds are meant to perform certain kinds of emotion. Maybe you could think about a crowd watching a spectacular royal performance. Are they weeping? Are they showing awe? What kinds of emotional work is a group meant to do? Are they actually doing it? Often the reports of crowds at these events are they're not doing what they're meant to do. So there's some interesting tensions there, I think, as well. So there are kind of ways that you can think about what is your unit of analysis there. I think what is harder to do is to go, what does the individual in the crowd feel, unless you have an individual account. And so you kind of have to sort of assume that the crowd is a unit and not worry too much that Joe Bloggs in the middle of the crowd was having a different emotional experience. That couldn't happen or didn't happen, but just because if you don't have evidence of that, there's not much you can do, I guess, to capture those the deviance, I guess, within emotional experience. And if you can capture that, then that's also an interesting thing. What made it different from him, for Joe Bloggs, from everyone else? Why did they not weep? Why were they not affected by this ritual? And then that often pinks you back to that resources. What did they have a different education? Did they have another experience that made them think differently about this experience? And you can kind of start to unpack why they might have a different response. And then we've got the things like the public, which are imagined communities. And then we're kind of thinking about, I guess, group conversations. And the thing I like about the public as a concept is that it's not everybody thinks the same. And you can see that because, like, if you go on Twitter, right, it's lots of angry people having an argument. You go, this is angry, but also they're not all angry in the same way or for the same thing. It's a kind of emotional register that surrounds a particular conversation. And so it's also thinking about why tone, I guess, why does this particular conversation happen with that kind of mood, even though the individuals within it aren't all thinking or doing the same thing. And so it's also thinking about why certain kinds of conversations generate certain kinds of emotions, and what's causing that. And you maybe can explore the cultural context, I guess, which mobilize certain kinds of emotions next to certain kinds of conversations. So I don't know if that answers that, but I hope that maybe thinks about the different ways we think about those differences. The Academic Emotions book, small book, only 30,000 words, so, you know, very quick to read. I was interested in thinking about how do we learn to be academics, and then how do we do emotions as academics. And so I read lots and lots of writing by academics moaning. Basically, we moan a lot, right? But I looked at academics on social media and on blogs, and then on there's a lot of academic literature that interview academics about their jobs and what they say about it. And so I read all these texts of academics talking about what it was to be an academic, and they are very emotional. And I suggest that for the modern academic today, they in many countries have now grown up in this space of tension between the old vocational model, where you became an academic and you did it for life, and it was a bit like being in the church, and so there was a kind of a vocational self, and then the professional academic, who's one who understands that they have to have all the right things on their CV, and they have to have the grants, and they have to have the publications, and they have to behave in a particular professional model, and that these two things are both are part of what it is to be an academic, but they don't fit very well together. So academics often feel like they are kind of stuck between these two worlds, and they are trying to negotiate that relationship, and not always easily. And then they also, I felt like a lot of academics assume that if you're suffering, it is bad, right? And you might go, well, that's obvious, but is it? Is all pain bad? Maybe certain kinds of suffering are okay. Maybe certain kinds of suffering are necessary. And that's particularly, I think, the true. Like, say, if you feel as a man that women's equality is reducing your rights, then you might feel like you're suffering. But actually, women's rights are good, and so maybe you need to learn that your suffering isn't that important in this context. And so there's kind of times when suffering is actually very useful, and that we shouldn't necessarily see it as something that always has to be relieved or made better. But academics, when they talk about academic life, they go like this. They go, I feel bad about this, therefore it is wrong. And actually, it's a very important kind of part of how they do arguments, is that I feel bad, therefore it's wrong, which is not a really great foundation for ethical action. And so I kind of explore why academics think that suffering is automatically bad, and the kinds of subjectivities that creates in an academy that feels fraught at a particular time. But that's kind of what that book is about. Academics moaning, basically, is the key topic.
Well, I must read it. We have two more questions in Zoom. I don't know if you can read the first one from Matthias Bonfim.
Yes, so he's saying that how do we approach it when our sources are songs? In my case, 1970s love songs. He's trying to understand the vision of love in the repertoire of Brazilian singer, who's very famous. And we have a man talking about love and women that isn't far away from our own time. And they have the songs, and they have interviews by the artist talking about his ideas and what's the best way to study this case. It's a great question, and it also depends on what exactly you want to do, right? So some people just focus on lyrics and then think about it as another text, and what are they saying about love, what assumptions about how love works operate in the text, what role do the men and the women have, are the men all active and the women passive, are the women active? You can think about how you construct them. I thought about in pop songs the levels of violence in contemporary pop songs, so you might not get this cultural reference, but there's Florence and the Machine, who's a very famous British band, has a song called A Kiss with a Fist, and so a kiss and a fist punch, and it was very controversial because people said, you know, this promotes domestic violence, and she said, no, it's just referring to the fact that love is conflictual. But lots of Western pop songs think of love as a conflictual, a sort of two people who are kind of having to compete or fight each other to make love happen. And so it's a very sort of aggressive kind of love. So I kind of thought about how the lyrics talk about love as this kind of conflictual mode. But I also think you have lots of opportunity with song to think about sound and what kinds of emotions come with that. So but you then need to understand the culture's sense of its music. So does a culture think of sad songs that, why is a song sad? What makes it sad? What makes it happy? What makes it something that would create joy? So that's often about rhythm, and it's about the kinds of melodies and tunes that are used, the patterns in the music. And so you kind of think about, you put the love songs that you're studying into a wider context about, are these songs associated with sad music, happy music, cheerful music, and what difference does that sound make to how we interpret this work and to how it would be received by audiences. You can also think about where it's listened to. Is it in a nightclub? Is it in their bedrooms, on a cassette tape? And what difference does those contexts make to how they respond to those kind of music? There's really nice work on 1980s nightclubs in Germany, for example, and the way that they produce ecstasy as a kind of emotional experience of extension beyond the self. And so you can kind of think about it in context too. So I think that there are many different ways you can do that, and you have to kind of decide whether you want to do all of it, or whether you think your real key concern, say, is how the lyrics discuss gender relationships, or how the sound supports a concept that love is a sad thing, and that it's a sort of a sad tradition. What's it mean if love is sad, for example? And you have lots of options, I guess, there. So I hope that helps a bit with that.
Thank you very, very much, Katie. And there's another question from Francisco Rios, who, first of all, says that he enjoyed very much your talk. And he is asking, could it be that the history of the emotions can also respond to questions linked to other methodologies, such as gender, for example, and use concepts such as performance to do so? And he also tells, how can we get your books, because it's very difficult in Mexico. But Susana is telling me that we are going to ask
Our library
to buy them for our library, because we are really looking forward to our students reading you.
Cool. Well, do you know what LibGen is? So LIBGEN, then dot, I can't remember what the dot is. It's a legal downloading site, but lots of my books are on there, just so you know. So if you have no conscience around illegal downloading, which I don't, then you can download them as well. Sorry, what was the question about?
The gender.
Gender, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Gender is actually, gender is quite straightforward for performance theory, because Judith Butler, who wrote about performance, one of the first people to, well, not the first, but one of the people who did a lot of work on this, she wrote about it in terms of gender, not emotion. And so she said that the body becomes gendered through the things that we do. So you wear clothing that signals that you're female or you're male, or that you're a third gender. You wear your hair in particular ways, and that you can also disguise yourself, or you can transform your body to look in different ways. And so that gender isn't just a natural or inherited innate characteristic, it's actually also a performance of how you do gender in the world, and how people interpret or receive that. So some people perform, some people are received as female or male very easily, and other people aren't, depending on a whole set of different things. And so, so in a way, when you think about emotions as a performance, they are performances that are done by gendered bodies. And so therefore, you can't really get away from the fact that that gendered part of the story is always going to tell us something about what emotions you're allowed to express, or that particular kind of body is allowed to express or not, and how that kind of plays out in particular cultures. Or indeed, that there might not be many differences across gendered bodies, that people might all express anger in the same way, for example. But because we, in performance theory, we do focus on what does this particular body bring to this situation, then gender becomes a kind of normal part of how you would analyse that situation. But so would race or disability or any other physical marker, I guess, that signals to other people that there's something about your body that is meaningful and that would help them interpret a situation. And so you just kind of build that into as one of the resources or parts of your performance situation that you're studying. So does that help with that?
Thank you very much. I mean, there are some other questions, but we don't want to extend anymore. Maybe a last one. Sorry, but I am very interested in that too. Could you tell us a little bit about the sources you used for your loneliness history, please, Katie?
Yeah, the World History and Loneliness is a bit of a different project because I was trying to compare cultures, very different cultures. There's, we've got Papua New Guinea and we've got some South America, but we've got like lots of European stuff. And so I was reading a lot of secondary material, like what did historians and anthropologists describe for these different societies and cultures. And so in that book, it's kind of maybe more based on other people's observations, but that's part of what I talk about as well, is actually what does it mean that when we're using particular, like especially the anthropological work, which is often done by British or American people observing cultures that they think are very different from them. Like what difference does your observer make to how we interpret the emotions that are going on in those societies? And that's kind of different from when a society explains itself, and you have to be careful of that. But that particular book is really thinking about how different people have observed loneliness in different environments and what we can build a picture up around that, about how loneliness works. But also, and what I want to do in that book is to ask that question: how do you do comparison across culture? What does it mean? Because we use different languages and different words, and loneliness isn't a word that exists in every language. So you've kind of got to think about, can we have an emotional experience without the word? If we have an experience that looks very, very similar to our experience of loneliness, is it the same thing? And so that's the conversation that the book encourages, is to think about, well, what does it mean to do cross-cultural comparison of emotion?
Well, thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. We are very pleased to have you here in UNAM. Bueno, muchas gracias a quienes nos acompañaron. Damos el cierre a esta sesión y le doy la palabra a la doctora Estela para que diga una despedida para la doctora Katie.
Sí. Katie, thank you again. And we are very happy that your talk has been recorded, as you know, so we can listen to you again, and we can listen with our students all what you have told us today. And thank you very much. We are looking forward to seeing you next year in Mexico, hopefully. And thank you. And we will be in touch for sure. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.